and highlight some key images and passages in the book there. So shall I begin, or
what we want to do first is just do our opening Dharma verses. If
okay.
John will ring the bell, and then we'll hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
The unsurpassed, profound, and wondrous Dharma is rarely met with even 100,000 million kalpas. Now we can see and hear it, accept and maintain it. May we unfold the meaning of the Tathagata's truths.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen Hahn. We hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to put this share screen. Is that viewable to everyone?
It is.
Okay. All right. Well, this is the okay. So this is this book. Dogen, Japan's original Zen teacher, is part of a series with Shambhala Publishing called Lives of the Masters. And in this series, which had started a few years ago, and so far has mainly covered Indian and Tibetan Buddhist teachers, and pre-modern and modern. And so this Dogen book is one of two that just came out on East Asia. The other one's on the Chinese pilgrim to India, Xuanzang, from the 7th century. So one thing they asked for for each book in the series is to have a frontispiece with a picture or portrait of the master who's being discussed. So some of you will probably recognize this one. This is one of two famous portraits of Dogen that we have from Dogen's era. The other one is more of a close-up, and generally is seen, the way it's seen today is more of a close-up of his face and his upper body, and also has an inscribed poem. And this one is, the main theory is that this one maybe wasn't from Dogen's time, but was done a generation or two later at his temple at Eiheiji. But it does have an inscribed poem that we do feel that Dogen himself wrote. Let me just say a few words about these portraits. If you're not familiar, this was a very typical Zen artistic motif to have highly specialized portraits of the masters. They borrowed some of the imagery from the imperial order. So the high seat, and sometimes it is referred to as a throne, sort of resembles what the emperor might have been sitting on. And the posture is also a little bit similar to the imperial side. The masters are usually facing sideways, sometimes left or sometimes right. Their hands are to their side. Sometimes they're holding a fly whisk or a staff. Not in this case. The shoes are usually off as the legs are crossed, and very often they have an inscribed poem, and sometimes the poem is written by the person whose portrait it is. In this case, it's Dogen's own poem. It's found in Dogen's extensive record, volume 10. If you consider this portrait to be real, then who am I, really? But why put it there if not to give people a chance to get to know me? When you look at this painting and think that what's hanging in empty space embodies the real me, your mind is clearly not one with the wall-gazing meditation referring to Bodhidharma, who gazed at the wall of a cave for 9 years, according to Zen legend. So Dogen is raising some interesting issues here about illusion and reality. He's known for saying, contrary to the stereotypical view that a painting of a rice cake cannot satisfy hunger, Dogen is known for saying only the painting of a rice cake can satisfy hunger, in the sense that if you're attuned to Buddha nature, all things are emanating with the truth of Buddha nature, and the teaching comes through even in something that may seem to be illusory. And the painting of a rice cake can satisfy hunger conceptually, spiritually, intellectually, and from a religious standpoint. But here he's making kind of the opposite point, that this painting is an illusion. It's not really him. It's part of a kind of ritual celebration that he acknowledges and that he contributes to. But but you don't take it too seriously. Now, in addition to the portraits being very conventional that were done of living Zen masters or recently deceased Zen masters, the portraits, there were also portraits of different sorts of Shakyamuni Buddha and many other luminary figures in Buddhism. And Dogen wrote poems about several of those, including a couple of poems about his own teacher in China, Ru Jing. And he actually wrote 20 poems on self-portraits or portraits of himself. And we don't know how many of those were actually made. As I mentioned, mainly 2 are surviving, but there may have been others at the time, or maybe he did multiple poems for the same ones. But so this shows Dogen. It shows him in the stylistic pose. We do get a sense of his face, his features, the look in his eyes. His face does look recognizable if you consider the other well-known portrait of him. But he's counseling us to not get too caught up in the accuracy or the importance of the actual painting compared to his true spiritual self. So I think this is one theme that runs in Dogen's writing, reality and illusion, and he has different responses given the context, which is another theme, that Dogen is sometimes kind of contradictory, paradoxical for sure. Does he change his mind? Does he change his style of writing? Does he have different points of view? Or is there an underlying consistency that goes throughout his various approaches, even though they sometimes, at least on the surface, seem to conflict with one another, but maybe that's all part of Dogen's teaching approach. That's the view that I basically have, and I think a lot of followers of Dogen today would endorse the view of an underlying consistency, but I like to be sensitive and aware of the apparent inconsistencies and see what we can learn from looking at those and putting those in context chronologically and geographically. So a lot of what I like to do with Dogen is to look at what part of his life was a particular expression from, whether it was a writing, a sermon, a poem, artwork, and or calligraphy, and how do we understand the social, historical, personal context of what he might have been thinking at the time, what challenges he was facing in building his community. We know that it was a good time for Zen. Zen was developing in Japan in his era, and he was one of the prime movers and shakers, of course, but it was also a time when challenges were faced by Zen leaders like Dogen. And we know that in the midst of his career, when he had built his first temple, Koshoji Temple in Kyoto, he was in a situation where he left Kyoto for the relatively remote mountains, and there he built a Heiji. And that happened in 1243, and he died 10 years later. But the reasons for his moving there and the reasons that led him to change communities are not well described by Dogen himself or by other sources from that period. So we have to kind of piece things together if we want to understand it. And one thing we do see is that some of the styles of writing and maybe some of the content of what he says and what he's preaching has shifted somewhat in those contexts. Let me say a little bit more about that point about Dogen's moving from the capital in Kyoto, where he started his temple. Actually, it was in the outskirts of Kyoto, and it was generally considered the second Zen temple in Japanese history in Kyoto. Although in some ways the first temple, Kenninji Temple, which was founded by ASZC in 1202, where Dogen did study for close to 10 years before he went to China. ASZC's Kenninji Temple is sometimes not really considered a Zen temple because it was mixed with Tendai practices and other kinds of rituals. So in that sense, Dogen could be considered the first temple in Kyoto. But he moved in 1243 when one of his contemporaries who just came back from China had a very large temple built for him. This was Eni Benin, who had Tofukuji Temple built in Kyoto by the aristocratic family of Fujiwara the same year that Dogen decided to leave. And so that raises a question: why did Dogen leave? Was it based, at least in part, on the idea that another Zen teacher who went to China after he did, and so it was a junior person to Dogen, was receiving support for various reasons from the aristocrats that he maybe didn't receive? Was that a factor? There's some stories that Dogen's temple in Kyoto was threatened by rival Buddhist monasteries, that maybe it was actually burned down, and maybe that's why he left. And why does he not talk about his leaving? Dogen does talk about his career. I mean, one of the best ways to get to know Dogen is to see what he says about his own motivations and his own actions. If you look at several of his writings, he's the one who's telling us, he's the one who's giving us some information and some kind of backstory about what he's thinking at the time. So it's particularly interesting that he doesn't say why he's leaving the mountains. And anyway, the point I want to make on that regard is that some years ago, this probably goes back to the 1990s, when studies of Dogen and interest in Dogen was growing in the US, but not, I think it's continued to grow since then. And so it was a little bit lesser stage 30 years ago. But was building. But anyway, I remember going to a couple of academic conferences where the history of Zen, including Dogen, was being discussed by various people giving lectures. And one of the things that came up a couple of times that I would hear, it wasn't always said in front of me or to me, but it was, I would be in the audience, or I'd hear it secondhand, was that, I think these people were trying to understand the history well, but in my opinion, they ended up with a kind of bias against Dogen, not for, sometimes maybe they had Rinzai affiliations or whatever, but I don't think that, it was intended that way. But my point was that I would hear people say, like, oh, Dogen was forced out of Kyoto. He left with his tail between his legs. He could not survive well in Kyoto. There were Zen rivals, there were Tendai Buddhist rivals. The government was against him. And so he went to Eiheiji to get away from it all. And when you take it a little bit further, they might even say, oh, and once he got to Eiheiji, he was never really the same. He became very old-fashioned, and he didn't, he was not as strong a thinker at that point. and so forth and so on. And you know, when I would realize that, hey, when this kind of discourse was being put out there, you know, some people would tend to buy into it because, you know, they didn't know, they hadn't done their own research, or they, you know, they didn't know enough, and these were sort of trusted voices, and so they accepted it. And I realized that this stereotype was getting set up in the American discussions of Dogen, that somehow Dogen was kicked out of Kyoto, and that there's some truth to it, probably. But the other thing was that somehow he was in a downhill spiral in the last part of his life when he was up in the mountains at Heiji, which I think is completely off the wall interpretation. But I tried to track down, like, where are these people getting that? And I won't go into a lot of detail, but I realized that there were a couple of prominent places in English, you know, discussions of Dogen that had come out in the 1980s, especially, where that was the implication. And of course, there's a kind of whispering down the lane effect where people mimicking what they read a little bit, you know, they elaborate a little bit more, and it sounds like a tough story about Dogen. So one of the things I tried to do beginning in the 1990s and published several books about it over the years was to re-examine Dogen's whole career and look at this issue of what were the two main parts of his career like. I actually divide Dogen's life into 4 parts, which I'll get into a little bit later, but the Kyoto part versus the Heiji part in the mountains. How do we understand what he was doing in those two geographical and chronological phases? And I think there are changes, as I said. I think there are kind of quote unquote inconsistencies, but you know, I think he was a remarkably astute, savvy leader and productive writer of, you know, long-lasting Zen writings in both of those stages, and you know, and that's what I wanted to try to bring to this book. Now, if I scroll down a little bit to the table of contents, so there's, as you can see here, there's a preface and an introduction, and then there's 2 main parts of the book: Life and Thought and Literature and Legacy. So the Shambhala publishers came to me a few years ago, and they said, hey, we got this series on the lives of the masters. We want to expand to China, Japan. You know, why don't you do something on Dogen? And you know, I was very interested, and they said, okay, we have a certain formula. One part of the book is kind of biographical issues. The other part of the book would be a translation of some of his main writings. So, you know, what I said was the biographical part interested me because what I wanted to do was kind of compress a lot of the thinking that I had developed over the years about Dogen's life and especially these 2 main teaching stages, which are discussed in chapters 3 and 4, but also his travels to China and what he did and didn't do there. Meaning, when I say didn't do, I mean as opposed to what some of the legends say, if we kind of clarify historiographically. So I was eager to do that. On the second part, I said, you know, there's enough translations of Dogen's core stuff out there, and there's enough volumes, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with those volumes, where there's anthologies of some of the leading writings. And look, some of these main texts that you would turn to, Bendoa, Genjo Koan, and others have been translated, you know, 12, 24 times already. So I said there's not really a point in trying to reproduce what's already been done well in numerous other books. And some of those books were published by Shambhala, so they, you know, they got my point. And I said what I could do there, contribute, that I think hadn't really appeared in English, is a kind of very systematic approach to listing and categorizing the various writings by Dogen, which I divide up into what I call miscellaneous writings that are kind of single works, independent works, collections, which are Shobogenzo, Eihei Koloku, and a couple of others that are the writings that were accumulated based on years of his writing production. And so, the second part of the book is in the first two chapters trying to give analysis of the miscellaneous writings and collections, and then the last chapter is legacy of Dogen, and talking about, well, some of the issues involved, like how do we inherit, how do we appropriate, how do we apply Dogen today, and what are some of the lessons, kind of what would Dogen do if we think about it from a contemporary standpoint. I wanted to make that longer, but I was kind of at the word count limit for the manuscript. I was already past it a little bit, so I kept that to one chapter. And so, to sum up some of the main points before I go into more details, in addition to reality versus illusion, I think one of the main points that I try to bring out is Dogen's basic view that he says, especially in the fascicle Zazen Shin, or when I mention some of these fascicles, I know they get translated in different ways, and so I'll just mention a translation that I generally use, even though other ones might sound a little different. So Zazen Shin is lancet of Zazen, or lancet of seated meditation. And he uses a phrase there, Buddhas becoming Buddhas. So it's not that people become Buddhas, or it's not that sentient beings turn into Buddhas or make themselves into Buddhas. It's that Buddhas realize that they are Buddhas. I think that's a key idea that you find in many of his great writings, especially I go back to Bendowa and Genjo Koan. These were both early writings in the early 1230s that are still kind of remain very strong and popular, partly because they're very interesting to read, and they kind of both are great introductions. And the more you read them, the more you realize there's more to try to understand and more to penetrate. So you can read them dozens of times and still find things of interest. That's true of the other Dogen writings as well. But I think that Buddhas realizing that they are Buddhas and they're practicing on the basis of that realization is one of the main themes that's typical of Dogen, and that was a little bit different from the Zen that he was used to, both in China and in those early days of Zen in Japan in the 13th century, where there was more of a one scholar of Dogen, Heijin Kim, who wrote one of the first great books of Dogen in the 1970s when I was in graduate school. And that was one of the first great books I read. It's still a great book, although outdated in some ways. But anyway, Heijin Kim and others have referred to the instrumental view of Zen versus the realizational view, which could also be referred to as the Shikantaza view of the continuous sitting practice that is not a means leading to an end. Another theme that I try to bring out, and especially in the last chapter, but also in other passages, is the idea of dignified demeanor. So I think one of the things that characterized let's put it this way, that Dogen tried to epitomize in his writings and in the activities that he promoted at his temples was the notion that the dignity of the demeanor was a main criteria underlying the writings. Now, obviously, writings were important to Dogen. He was a great writer. He came in history at the juxtaposition of tremendous influence from China and Chinese to Japan, and its impact on Japanese religion, literature, and culture in the 13th century. And he was able to integrate those languages in his writings in very innovative ways that were I still considered unmatched for the ingenious quality that he brought to putting Chinese and Japanese together. Just if you're not familiar, a couple of the basic differences is that even though Japanese uses a lot of the Chinese characters, and so looking at characters is basically the same. The grammars are kind of night and day. Chinese verbs have no tenses. There's no declining of verbs. So it creates a very ambiguous and open-ended sentence, even in simple sentence structures. Whereas Japanese does have a much more detailed grammatical structure, but it also has a lot of ambiguity because even though the verbs have tense endings and so forth, they don't have gender endings, and a lot of times the subject of the verb tends to be deleted, so you don't know if the action is who the action is referring to, whether it's first person. A sentence could be first person or not. So what happens is there's a lot of ambiguity in both languages that he tries to build upon by showing that underneath the ambiguity can reflect from a Zen spiritual realizational based standpoint a deeper level of understanding that reveals Buddhas becoming Buddhas. And so that even a simple word like the word sometimes can trigger off a whole philosophical insight into what's usually translated as being time, or there is a time being, which becomes a very profound notion of how to understand the relation between time and death, and present, past, and future. And so what he tried to do was to use language, but he also wanted to show that dignified demeanor is just as or more significant than his playfulness with language. So I think the another introductory comment I want to make is about something called that's been called in English critical Buddhism, Hihan Bukkyo in Japanese, that sometimes gets mixed in with engaged Buddhism, and there is a certain similarity between those terms, critical Buddhism and engaged Buddhism. And so let me say a little bit about this term critical Buddhism and how it influenced my thinking about Dogen over the years, and still I do bring that term into some of the discussion here to understand the changes Dogen went through in the various career stages. So when I was first going to Japan to study Dogen and the history of Japanese culture from that period in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was there were a lot of great things happening because the interest in Dogen in Japan was expanding after kind of a period where it was overlooked, and there were so many new books being published and new activities happening on in many different ways that it was a very exciting time. But then during the 1980s, I didn't get a chance to get back to Japan for a few years for various reasons. And when I got back to Japan in the late 1980s, I found that something very interesting and important had happened in the world of Japanese Buddhism, and it had a big impact on understanding Dogen. So to put it in a nutshell, it was a time when the Japanese bubble economy was still going strong, but that seemed to help to highlight various social issues, including discrimination against what's known as an outcast community in Japan. That's a very long and complicated story, but again, to keep it short, all the Japanese Buddhist sects, including Soto Zen, were being criticized by various parties for helping to endorse the discrimination against social outcasts, which is or another way to put it is a minority group in Japan. And the basic idea was that the complicated issue of karma was being interpreted on an everyday level as a kind of you get what you deserve view of morality. So that those who suffered, they must have had bad karma in some lifetime or this lifetime to deserve that suffering. And that was what some of the Buddhist sects were more or less endorsing. And there were more specific issues of discrimination in terms of the way funeral services were administered and the way the Buddhist sanghas were structured in Japan. Very long and complicated story, but how does it relate in particular to Dogen? Well, when I came back to Japan after a hiatus of a few years, the hiatus took place during the mid-'80s. At that time, there was a big crisis with the discrimination issue. And the Soto sect had commissioned some scholars and priests to look into the question, what truth is there in the sect and in Dogen, and basically they came to the conclusion that, Dogen was one thing and how the sect had developed was over the centuries with various historical conditioning was, could be separated out. Again, a kind of a long story, but the big issue with Dogen came up, which was that you go back to this early and late period of Dogen, the teaching in Kyoto during the 1230s to 1243, and his approach in the mountains in the 1240s till his death in 1253. You come back to that issue, and the critical Buddhists were saying that actually, if you look at Dogen's view of karma, and how it would relate to societal and possible discriminatory or overcoming discriminatory and biased viewpoints, they said he actually had a kind of revival at a rebirth and like a much clearer and more profound understanding later in his career. And they wanted to call attention to some of his writings that were kind of neglected over the years because karma was not considered such an exciting issue in a way compared to others in topics. But they pointed out that if you look at the late writings of Dogen, he seems to be quite clear that he's criticizing his contemporaries at that time and other forms of Buddhism for not endorsing a very clear and straightforward view of karma. So again, in a nutshell, a typical Zen view at the time that you would find in some koans, for example, is that causality and non-causality, supporting karma or releasing from karma are two sides of the same coin. And some of Dogen's early writings do seem to indicate an endorsement of that view. And the later view is that that Dogen endorsed was no, you can't say causality and non-causality are combined. They have to have a much more nuanced approach that does not dismiss causality. And this comes up in his interpretation of several koans, like the killing of the cat koan and the appearance of a mysterious fox, which was being punished for bad karma. Those two koans, which are in Gateless Gate collection and other collections, were examined extensively by Dogen. And according to critical Buddhism, we had to consider that Dogen actually was a clearer and more productive thinker towards the end of his career. I'm not saying I endorse everything that critical Buddhism says, or that's my view, because I'm trying to look at Dogen from all these different angles in a Dogen-esque way. I'm trying to look at Dogen in an open-ended, flexible, and let's see what let's see what the facts are in front of us rather than coming to a particular view. But I have to say that after all these years, and critical Buddhism pretty much died out, the two of the main thinkers that were involved at that, have long retired, or one recently retired, but he wasn't very involved in that topic in his later years, although he and I did have some intense discussions of it up until his retirement just about 2 years ago. But it's in there. Okay, now let's move on to a preface. Now, they asked me in the preface to kind of have what you might call a noir approach, if we use the term noir from the film industry and related kind of interpretations, meaning like, what's your own existential involvement in the investigation? So noir is known for detective stories, and I remember, a colleague at the San Francisco Zen Center once said, people kind of scrutinizing Dogen and other aspects of Zen from a historical perspective these days are Dharma detectives. And it is kind of detective work to see, like, well, what did he really write and what was part of the legends? So my own existential involvement, happened, and I talk about a couple of incidents that took place when I was first studying in Japan. And to make a long story short, I felt that this sense of commitment to this mission, which a lot of people have, fortunately, and a lot of people are doing a great job into putting forward Dogen into the 20th and now the 21st century, and try to bring it to life, but in a way that's true to the historical period. Now, one of the things I always got interested in with Dogen was his poetry, and he wrote two kinds of poetry: Japanese waka poetry, which is an example here, 31 syllables. In Japanese, they're not always duplicated. That's not always duplicated in English translations. And then he also wrote poetry in the Chinese style that has a different structure. And we'll see an example of that a little later. This was one of his famous waka poems that had been mentioned by the great Japanese novelist Yasunari Kawabata, who was the first Japanese to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1968. And that's back when I was in college. And I hadn't really thought much about Dogen at that point, but I was fascinated by medieval Japanese religion and literature and the coincidence of, why did so many Japanese Buddhist priests write poetry of both the Japanese style and the Chinese style. And Kawabata happened to mention Dogen at the very beginning of his lecture. And, I came to realize afterwards, for me, I didn't really get involved in Dogen studies for another 8 or 10 years after that. But then I started to realize, hey, this had been a big factor because it really helped to introduce Dogen to a much larger community in Japan and in the world. But as I studied it more deeply, I also came to see that the famous translation of Kawabata's Nobel Prize lecture by the translator Edwin Seidenstecker, who's known for many different translations from Japanese. And I think it's fair to say he was a great translator of prose Japanese, but he hadn't really studied the poetry. As you can see here, he has the poem, a very succinct translation in 4 lines rather than 5 lines. That's kind of telling that he hasn't probably fleshed out the whole meaning of it. And basically, what I came to see as one of my epiphanies on this path was that, I had some people in Japan telling me this, so it wasn't just me, but that this term Suzushi in the end, which he translates as snow, clear, cold, in talking about the 4 seasons, has a much fuller meaning when you look at the Japanese context And this word Suzushi, which can literally mean cool or cold in a physical sense, actually was used very much so in those centuries the way we would use the word cool today, meaning like it's a feeling, it's an impression, it's a sensation, it's not physical, it's a state of mind.
Dr. Heine, can I interrupt
Yes.
for a moment? Before you
Yeah.
move on, would you mind reading it aloud? It's too small for us to read from our distance here.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you. So the Seidenstecker translation was: in the spring, cherry blossoms. In the summer, the cuckoo. In autumn, the moon. Now, those first three lines are basically fine, because that's part of what the poem does. It just lists, this is what Kawabata points out, it just lists the season and a phenomenon from that's prototypical of the season. You know, it's very simple, but deceptively simple. And that's what, you know, Japanese culture often did, was to try to capture the essence with the fewest words possible, and what some scholars call the plenitude of meanings underneath those few words. But the fourth and last line in Kawabata's translation says, and in winter, the snow clear and cold, which is where the problem comes in, because it's a more complicated meaning. And so I'm skipping down a few pages where I give the translation that I've used. So the first three lines start pretty much the same way, but those last two lines I have: in winter, the frozen snow. Yes, okay, that's the fourth season and the fourth phenomenon. You had cherry blossoms, the birds singing, the moon shining, and now the snow freezing. But Suzushi in the last line in Japanese means how pure and clear all the seasons are, one word. And I'll never forget, you know, a Japanese scholar that I was studying with. We were, you know, who didn't generally use English, but he kind of burst out. He said one word, you know, and it was like, yeah, it was quite an epiphany for me, because I realized, yeah, and you know, checking it in the Japanese literary context, that really rings true. Other poets were using it at that time, but what Dogen is doing, as Kawabata points out, is that he's going beyond the kind of cyclical rotation of the seasons and celebrating nature into the level of spiritual awareness. So the lesson for me was, okay, look at the spiritual quality in whatever Dogen is talking about. Look for the dignified demeanor, look for the Buddhas becoming Buddhas, look for his use of wordplay and paradox coming through to bring out philosophical nuances. Now, I'm still in the introductory section here, but or the preface actually, so I know time is going by, but here's another poem. In the heart of the night, moonlight framing a small boat drifting, tossed not by the waves, nor swayed by the breeze. Apparently, Dogen wrote that poem at a time in his life of uncertainty, of probably traveling from one part of Japan to another with a sense of uncertainty, maybe even a sense of dread. But he says the small boat drifting, which could be Dogen himself, is not tossed by the waves nor swayed by the breeze. And that sense of you know, self-confidence, of fortitude, of standing up to the challenges, I think is something that comes through in, you know, throughout Dogen's writings and many stages of his life. Okay, so very briefly, and I know the scrolling may, you know, be tough on the eyes here, but let me go down to a passage where I start talking about Dogen's life. And this is a well-known passage, I'm sure many of you read, from Bendoa or Discerning the Way. Shortly after my aspiration arose to seek the Dharma, I began searching through our country for a knowledgeable teacher. And I practiced at Kenninji Temple for 9 years. That's all he says. And we don't know much about those 9 years. But then he decided to go to China and find out more in China, and eventually trained with his master Ru Jing, where he gained enlightenment in China. and Rujing taught him the way of Shikantaza. So in these 2 paragraphs, I'm not going to look at it all, but the point is that Dogen is creating his narrative here. In just a couple of sentences, he's telling us what his aspirations were, what his activities were, what his goal was, how he feels about that goal. And it's kind of remarkable because at that time in history, the objective historical records are still kind of limited. So we have to depend on what Dogen is telling us. That's why, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, when he doesn't tell us why he moved from Kyoto to to the mountains, that's interesting because he does seem to be eager to get his story across. Now, of course, when he got to China, one of the most interesting things that happens to him is when he meets a couple of cooks, a couple of temple cooks, and you're probably familiar with those stories in Tenzo Kyokun. This is a very interesting statue that is in a temple in a very congested part of Tokyo, and this has been one of my interests over the years of temples and shrines in Tokyo, and I wrote a separate book about that a few years ago. But if you're you can be walking along in a congested area in Tokyo. This happens to be near a famous university called Waseda University, but it's a few blocks away. And there's a lot of little temples tucked away in those back alleys in this part of Tokyo, and they represent different sects. And then you go into one that's a Soto sect, and lo and behold, here's a statue. The picture doesn't do it justice, of Dogen meeting the cook at the temple who is drying mushrooms. And it's such a powerful story that through this icon lives on today. And the story that, Dogen is saying, hey, get somebody to help you. You're too old, you're bent over. And Dogen says, hey, the sun was baking his bald head. And, basically I felt very sorry for the guy. I wanted to help him out. And he said, no, it's my job. Nobody else does my job. And so, that aspect of Dogen, I think, is, we can look at Dogen's literature and eloquence and elegance in writing, but, it comes back to a lot of these very personalistic stories that he had of his encounters, his realizations, his epiphanies. Okay, so moving ahead, in the first chapter, I talk about some of the historical issues. How do we know what Dogen said is accurate or not, or is he exaggerating? And how do we know? And what other sources do we look at? Let's assume Dogen is basically on target. He's not trying to mislead us. But he's not trying to be, an historiographer either. So a lot of it is a little bit open-ended. What are other sources that we use? So this is what I talk about in the chapter, and some of the historical sources, build up legends over the years. So there's legends upon legends. This issue of why he left Kyoto, his temple was burned down. Well, when you try to track it down, is there historical record from the government or the Buddhist institutions at that time that says this? And there's not really. Well, then you could think, well, maybe that information was suppressed. Maybe they didn't want to put it in the records. Maybe they just, these things happen and they didn't make it to the record keeping at all. How do we make sense of all that? A lot of it, we have to just leave the question marks open and come to the conclusion, in my opinion, well, we make sense. We can pin down what we can pin down, and what we can't pin down, we have to recognize, but let's not overemphasize or exaggerate the legends. Okay, so one of the big aspects of Dogen's life was his birth and his upbringing. So I think if we go back to some of these early some basic aspects of who Dogen was, as best we can put it together. We can see a key to why he's so remarkable. On the other hand, again, maybe he was remarkable, and historians and legend makers over the years had to justify it, so they made up some of these stories. But we can seem to track down from various records that Dogen was born to a Minamoto clan father, just as this samurai clan was becoming very powerful in Japan. His mother was not the first wife, but the second or third wife of the father, from the Fujiwara clan, which had been in power before the samurai started taking over, including the Minamotos. But their power, although eclipsed, was never really, it did not disappear overnight. So we have to see that the Fujiwara clan was very important in promoting Dogen's early life, and also in helping the development of Zen in Japan, although they had kind of mixed feelings about Dogen's temple building. He got some support from the Fujiwaras, and apparently they declined in some instances. And that the samurai father was also a descendant of the imperial line. So naturally, Dogen was brought up very well educated, destined for an elite career in the court system. He would have studied and memorized vast amounts of Chinese and Japanese literature at an early age. And he would have been at the pinnacle of Japanese society if he had chosen that path, but he renounced that path for the sake of becoming a home leaver, for becoming a monk. Now, this chart tries to put together the different lineage, both personal and religious. So what was his family background, and where did he stand in relation to receiving influences from other Buddhist figures and creating his own lineage in the Soto sect, and also in relation to a rival school called the Dharma school, which was an early school of Zen in Japan that died out and was very much criticized by Dogen and others. But the early days of Soto Zen were very much infused with members of the Dharma school who came to study with Dogen. So I realize time is going by, and everything is impermanent. So let me just scroll through for a couple other things, and then we can have some discussion if you have questions. So this image is a scene where Dogen is challenging the head monks with his so-called great doubt. If everything is Buddha nature, then why practice? And this scene happened in 1213 or 1214 when he was first a monk. And then the fact that they could not answer, this young guy could not get the answer from these elders, led him to study Zen, led him to practice in Japan for 10 years, and then go to China to try to get the answer. Okay.
He was 13 at the time, 13.
Pardon me?
I was just telling the group here, that means he was 13 at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Okay, this image, this is what they say his backpack would have looked like. One thing I've always wondered is, like, Dogen knew so much, learned so much in China. How did he bring it all back? He must have had stacks and he wasn't the only one in that period, but he must have had stacks and stacks of scrolls that he would have brought back. This was his backpack. Now, I've had endless conversations with people in Japan and China. Well, what else did he do? Did he have an entourage of people with him? did they travel around on horses so that they could haul heavy loads of manuscripts and other paraphernalia? He says he comes back to Japan empty-handed. I like to say he was empty-handed, but not empty-headed. But I don't think, this backpack would have carried everything. But this is in a museum in Japan, and that's what they say, the actual travels were like. Okay, so let me, this is Kaz Tanahashi's calligraphy of Shinjin Datsuraku, casting off body mind. So I thank Kaz for his contribution. And let me wrap up before asking for questions with a couple of tables in part 2. Well, okay. Actually, I want to say a few words about his writing. So this is a manuscript that's in Dogen's hand. There aren't many of these available, but this one still exists. This is the Sansui Kyo fascicle. In one version that he was editing, it's number 29. And, Dogen wasn't necessarily a great calligrapher, but we can see here that he can combine the very formal style with the title and very clear letters that shows his strong aristocratic educational background with the more cursive style that would have been used in some parts of the sentence structure. And so that's an interesting text to look at. And then let's see. Okay, let me conclude here then. This is the other famous portrait of Dogen, more of a close-up, a different poem. This was supposedly done while he was viewing the full moon. That was always a festive occasion and a time for poetry writing. And the moon viewing probably took place in 1247, 1248. So he was near the end of his life. Maybe he was about 47, 48 years old. And it does, I think, show a very good correspondence to what the image of Dogen was like. So I think, even though the strokes are kind of simple for the actual portrait, I think his dignified demeanor does come through. Okay, so let me, I can say more, but let me stop for questions.
I'll start while we're shifting the others. I've got 3 points for you, and
Okay.
I'm just going to put them together and answer to whatever degree you're interested. My early understanding of Dogen's, so-called Dogen's decline, I don't recall if you spoke of that at the conference or if somebody else did.
Yeah, I think that was probably me.
Yeah, that when he went to AHG, founded AHG,
Right.
he stopped writing. And so because that conference was practitioners versus scholars, so to speak, I understood this to be a scholarly assessment that he had a decline because he stopped writing. And
Right.
From our perspective and practice, of course, that's when he really started teaching.
Yeah.
And so the Eikotoku, his extensive record, was recorded by his disciples. So you're apparently you're indicating he continued writing then. So that's one that I could ask you to comment on. In the portrait, I stumbled across the Hongji portrait, who he quotes quite often.
Yeah.
From about 100 years earlier, and it's exactly the same posture, chair, stool, etc. So it occurred to me that whoever painted Dogen had to be familiar with the Hongji portrait.
Right.
And then the third point was the meeting of the monk, or the Tenzo, the cook, with the mushrooms. The translation I read of that exchange, the Tenzo comes back and says, when Dogen asked him why somebody else can't do this, he said, "They are not me." And that's a little bit different from saying it's my job.
Okay. All right.
Anyway, those are the 3 I came up with.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much. Yes, I mean, okay. So the transition generally is from Shobogenzo to Eihei Kodoku, right? And so one is more of written out essays, and one is more transcribed lectures.
Right.
I agree, and but at the same time, I think we have to say that Shobogenzo was also generally teaching exercise. Most of them originated as oral talks that were given, not in the Dharma hall, but in other parts of the temple. Whereas Eihei Kodoku was in the Dharma hall, but probably those were written out in advance. So I think it was a different style of writing, because Shobogenzo was more Japanese style and Eihei Kodoku was more Chinese style. But I think what happened was he kept. So what I would say is, is that, he was teaching the whole time.
And he continued writing, you think, at Eihei?
Well, he can, yes, because there are some essays. Eihei Shingi was mostly written at Eiheiji.
Right.
Yeah, okay. And on your second question, yes, Hongzhi, of course, was a tremendous influence on Dogen. And but all those portraits, from those 11th, 12th, 13th centuries are very, very close. They're, so whether it was somebody who influenced Dogen directly or not, they're all going to pretty much resemble one another. But yes, but it is very important. And in Eihei Kodoku, Dogen does cite Hongzhi very much, and his followers would definitely have been plugged into that. And
in
on
the European art tradition, you had what was called the Rembrandt 45. When you did a portrait, the person would be set at 45 degrees to the picture plane.
Okay.
And it looks like these are also 45.
Okay. So Rembrandt coming a little bit later, maybe.
A little bit.
Yeah, maybe the Dutch were being influenced by Asian art at that point. And on the Tenzo, I'm sorry, you said the translation you read said.
Translations, he said, "They are not me."
Okay, they are not me. Yeah,
That's
I'd
why
have to
they
look
can't- that's why
back
they
at the
can't do
original,
it.
but I definitely like that way of putting it. They are not me. So I crudified it a little bit by saying, it's my job.
Yeah,
Bringing
and folks,
Dharma down to earth.
and folks that are online, just please come off of mute. Yeah, and I see Yusin with the hand up, so go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Heine, for a very interesting talk and updating on your research on Dogen. For somebody who practiced in Zodo Zen for a long time, of course, have to know something about Dogen and sort of a religious genius that he is in his own right. But at the same time, studying modern Japanese Buddhism inspired me to study more on historical Buddhism, especially what influenced the Japanese Buddhism.
Yeah.
So, so I kind of come to a lot of sort of intersections between those two, in both more in scholar research ways than more in practical ways nowadays. I don't know if Dogen's always interpreted in terms of what his intention. I feel like a lot of his writings are very transpiring in terms of talking about who taught him and the history of where it comes from. But a lot of more modern writing, I think, like, for instance, like, writing a book is really hardly anything, right, to describe his learning and his work. So a lot of people kind of say this is what Dogen said. So I just want to know a little bit more about, in terms of your work, like, for instance, today 1 hour was hardly enough to really review your work or discuss it. Like, the terms that he was credited with, like, for instance, how Buddha becomes Buddha, which really came from Tathagata, right, as you know, that's been written over and over many, many ways since the 4th century. And of course, he learned that also from his Chinese monk teachers. And I actually gave a talk earlier last year to the Atlanta Zodo Zen Center about Shobogenzo, from what I have read numerous times, he came back with many, many scrolls from China. One of them including the original Shobo Gensho that was written by Dawei Zhonggao.
Yeah.
But like I said, I studied this because I wanted to learn more, like where does all these Japanese words come from? And I end up studying canonical Chinese and doing translations because of it. So I was wondering, do you go back in your book to talk more about, because those are really, really deep histories, right? Terms like how Buddha becomes Buddha, they're not Dogen terms. They're not Dogen concepts. They are very original core teachings of the Buddha. Yeah. Including Shinkantatsa that started with the early stages of Mahayana development back in India, right? Yeah. By the 1st century. So I'm really interested in history. So I'm just wondering, did you get a chance in your book to talk more historical perspective on how he translated them into the Japanese culture? Okay, good, great. Well, I appreciate hearing about your interest as well. In this book was a little bit more focused on, life and Dogen himself. I try to give a glimpse of what you're talking about occasionally with some of the Chinese influences, but I think on a book I had a couple of years ago called Readings of the Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, that was on Shobo Genzo. That's where I take a closer look at the Chinese and his, and Indian, traditional Buddhist influences and the Chinese influences on it. I think you're right. I mean, I think, what I would say to the general issue is that what makes Dogen so fascinating is that he becomes a window into both worlds. Like on one level, you can zoom in on, okay, this is what was going on in Zen in his temple at his time period and how that's influenced later centuries, including today. But at the same time, you can zoom out and see through Dogen, through so many of his phrases and word plays and using these things. Yeah, these are age old and they've been repeated and repeated, but each great master gives their own stamp to it, gives their own little twist to it, says it a little bit in their own way. And I think that's what we have with Dogen too. But the more you look into either history, the later history after Dogen in Soto Zen in Japan, or the earlier history of Buddhism, developing in India, and then Mahayana Buddhism, and then several centuries of Zen Buddhism, the better, no question, because it's just like one thing unfolds in another thing. So it's kind of like, for those of us who are old enough to remember pre-word processing and pre-computers, and then Windows comes out and you have tab after tab open and one thing leads to another thing. And that, that's kind of metaphorical of what happens, I think, as you're investigating the deeper structure of the Buddhist meanings that are encompassed in Dogen. So I hope that, indicates I agree basically with what you're saying, I think.
Dr. Steve, this is Fusats in Atlanta. And we, interestingly enough, we're just coming off of an Intro to Dogen weekend that San Shenji was doing. So, and they mentioned a lot about, Dogen's view when he came back from China to Japan, how he really had a specific view of how he expected the practice to be from the way that he set up his monasteries to know what he's teaching. Like you mentioned, the Buddha hall, the monastery hall, the kitchen, the bathroom. So did you get into this particular text about how his view of practice was influenced by what he brought back from China? And that was very distinct even now to when you were reading Dogen, and how it's actually transmitting into the way we practice in Soto.
Yes, again, a great question. And if I can, if you don't mind my tooting my horn about another one of my books a few years ago called From Chinese Chan to Japanese Zen, I have a whole chapter on the temples, Dogen and other Zen figures, and how that was, how the temple life in particular, the structure of the buildings, what happened in the temples, and how that was transported. And it's very interesting if you if you go to Heiji and some other Zen temples today, and of course, it's impossible to get into Japan until the COVID is over. But when you get a chance to visit, you can, they've kept it alive. Some of those buildings have been rebuilt over the centuries, but they follow the traditional model pretty well. I mean, Heiji itself, they say, is probably a few miles away from where it was back in Dogen's day. But Japan is expert in rebuilding, and China is as well. So if you go to some of the Chan temples that Dogen would have visited, and it's not that difficult because they're all in the proximity of an area a little bit south of Shanghai, where Zen was big in that 13th century. You can see, again, some of those temples were destroyed in the Cultural Revolution, but you can see that they've been recreated and very authentically based on the builders today examining the records and the scrolls that were available from the time on how you did it. They had very, very detailed, descriptions, how big, what proportionality, which monks should live in, which monks should be active in different quarters of the temple. There was an eastern side and western side. Dogen discusses some of that in Eihei. This book in particular, I wasn't quite as involved in that part of it, but yeah, it is crucial. I think we can benefit from the fact that in China, for better or worse, Buddhism went from a point in the Cultural Revolution where so many temples were destroyed, but over these last 30 or 40 years, they've been very much reconstructed. So it's very interesting to see it, and if you get a chance, and to compare it to what's happening in Heiji.
Thank you.
John?
Yes.
Come on out, John.
Dr. Klein, thank you for such a fantastic and interesting talk. My question is, at the time that Dogen was writing, what % of the Japanese population would have been literate at all? And what does that tell us, if anything, about who his intended audience was for all of the writing that he did?
Yeah. Yes, that's a very interesting point, because Dogen coming in the beginning of the samurai era, in a way, the samurai era was kind of democratizing Japan, because the samurai were not the elite classes, right, from a century or two before, but now they were getting educated in Chinese and Japanese literature. So there was part of an expansion of the literacy and of the interest in reading these kinds of works taking place, and Dogen contributed to that. And I think that the reason that the Shobogenzo was written, mainly in Japanese with some references to Chinese, was Dogen's attempt to say, like, hey, I'm in Japan. What the Buddha said is get the Dharma across through expedient means, through ways that are going to be effective to the time and place that you're doing it. So I am contributing to that. But another way of looking at the readability of Dogen, whether one is literate or not, is that Dogen's writing is so complicated and convoluted and intricate in some ways that it's very difficult to read by native Japanese. So if you turn the clock ahead to today, very, very few Japanese read Dogen in the original. They have to read what they call modern translation. So it's still in Japanese, but somebody's come along, and there's dozens of these available. Somebody's come along and kind of paraphrased it to make it accessible to the level of the Japanese audience today. So I sometimes, I'm not an expert on Chaucer, but one interesting thing I remember is that when you remember the era where there were great bookstores. There aren't so many left today. Maybe in Atlanta there's some, I don't know. But going back a couple of decades, when you go to a great bookstore in the U.S., and they might have a handful of good books about Zen or Buddhism, right? Relative handful. When you go to Japan, they're going to have a whole wall on Buddhism, and several big shelves just on Dogen. If you go to England, you go to Cambridge University and you go to a bookstore there, they're going to have a whole floor full of books about Chaucer. It really hit me how important Chaucer was in British culture. But the serious point I want to make is that Chaucer was somebody who was kind of on the verge between, you know, continental language, French and English, and writing about, you know, pilgrims going to Canterbury and teaching these moral lessons. Very different kind of writing, but the cultural impact of Dogen is very strong. But just like nobody's going to read Chaucer in the original day, nobody's going to read Dogen in the original, partly because the language is antique, and partly because it's just kind of too complicated without some explanations. But at the time, his audience, I believe, was monks who used Buddhism as a kind of mobility. It was a kind of social mobility, because they would provide you with the education. You know, the Sangha would provide you with the kind of stability in unstable times where your village may be threatened by samurais coming through and overtaking it. And so and when he went up into the mountains, look, the people were obviously less literate than in the capital, but that's where he started using more refined Chinese style language as well. So I think part of his goal was to disseminate, but part of the obstacle is that his thinking was such a high abstract level, you know, that it's hard. It creates its own challenges.
John Hinman had his hand. John Hinman.
Come up for you, John.
Thank you, Dr. Heine. Extremely interesting. Regarding Eiheiji, 20 years ago, while I was in Japan, I reached out by phone and contacted them. The person that took the call said, yes, I could come visit. I could enroll in an introductory program that they were conducting, but I should know two things. One is I would spend most of my day in the full lotus. And second, I should know that everything 100% would be in Japanese, and that I'd need to bring my own translator to facilitate that. My question for you is related to the Great Doubt. Clearly, Dogen was impacted in a major way by the Great Doubt. And you put it so succinctly when you said, if everything is Buddha nature, why practice? That's something that I'm engaging with actively day to day.
Yeah.
Could you, and you clearly have been impacted because you talk about it and write about it in a number of places. Could you share your own personal experience with your engagement with the Great Doubt?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for for those comments. Well, I think I said this in one book a few years ago. When I was a kid, you know, my father was a wonderful doctor, cardiologist, and people used to, you know, some of his patients I would see as a kid, you know, if I was in his office or they'd come by the home, and they would tell me, oh, you know, your father's so amazing and all this kind of thing. And, you know, I had a very high view of my father's abilities. And I was still a young kid. And I remember that they, you know, there was an ad for some kind of aspirin, you know, and they said like 3 out of 4 doctors, in the TV ad, it said 3 out of 4 doctors say take this kind of aspirin, right? And I said, well, my father's one, and his friend, Dr. Bear is another one. Who are the other 2 that they're talking about? You know, but also one day, you know, they said like somebody said your father's a wonderful practice, and I'm thinking to myself, he doesn't practice. He already is a great doctor. So yeah, hopefully I got that point across. So that's where I come back to Buddhists becoming Buddhists. I think, you know, I'm sure, you know, probably everybody here has engaged with that concept on some level as well. And in that chapter of the Shobogenzo, Zazen Shin, It starts out with the famous koan, thinking, not thinking, non-thinking. Those three, right? If you look at that dialogue, and that's been analyzed a lot of different ways, and mainly people say, okay, don't look at it as threefold. Don't look at it as a triangle. Don't look like you start with thinking, then you go to non-thinking, then you come back to non-thinking as some kind of transcendent. Don't look at it in those, kind of material, instrumental, means to an end ways. But how do you get past looking at it? How do you get past thinking about non-thinking as anything? What does that mean? Thinking is non-thinking. Well, if you go back and look at what he actually says there, he says we always already are non-thinking. Now, that might sound like another bit of abstraction, but the way I interpret it is that we know the doubt has already been solved within us, but we don't actually carry out that the doubt is always already solved within us. So we struggle with that doubt. Making the leap to that always already is, in my opinion, one of Dogen's biggest clues. Now, if you look at different translations of it, they may work the words a little bit differently. But anyway, I hope that brief comment may shed a little bit light.
Thank you.
Not going to ask for one more question. We have time for one more.
Gray T-shirt, I think that is.
Did anyone else? Yeah, come off mute. I think, is it Joseph?
Yeah, absolutely. I just really wanted to say, Dr. Hines, thank you so much for the thorough discussion and careful research and thoughtful analysis. And I really enjoyed the foregrounding of the question of illusion and reality. And I sort of liked your interpretation about the painting of the rice cake, saying that I sort of heard you saying spiritual hunger has to be sated by poetry, and maybe this sort of explains Dogen. I kind of wanted to ask something about Dogen's poetry practice, but I don't want to keep you here for another
No, go ahead.
entire hour. But
yeah.
If I had to ask a narrower question, I would just say you pointed to the appearance of a mysterious fox koan, and is that, you said, I think, the gateless gate, is that correct? And did you have any other, was that connected to anything, or
Yes, it is, because so the fox koan is number 2 in the gateless gate. And one way to look at it is like, number 1 is that does the dog up the Buddha nature. Number 14 is cutting the cat. Number 2 is the fox. And other times animals appear in these different stories, horses and so forth. So that's a kind of theme in itself. But going back to Dogen has 2 fascicles of Shobogenzo that deal specifically with the fox koan. One is called in Japanese Daishugyo, great cultivation. And the other is, and that was probably written earlier. That was definitely written earlier. And the one that was written later is called Jinshin Inga, deep faith in causality, deep belief in causality, deep belief in karma. And those are the 2, going back to this critical Buddhism, where they pointed out, hey, these are almost opposite interpretations, at least on the surface. I'm not saying that Dogen, was that contradictory, but if you're interested in that, if you're intrigued by that, go back and read the koan in Gateless Gate, and then read those 2 fascicles, and you'll see that in one, he says, yeah, karma, no karma, it's all the same. That's kind of the typical thing. But he says, like, hey, this, who is this fox? He gets into some very interesting questions about who's the fox, where's the fox come from? The fox dies and they give it a Buddhist funeral, and is that appropriate to give a fox a Buddhist funeral? And they say the fox lived 500 lifetimes, and he says, was that human lifetimes or fox lifetimes? And he asks some interesting questions. But in that second later version, he clearly says, like, you have to follow the path of causality. All Buddhists follow causality, and that creates a very different flavor in some ways. So can that flavor be used by critical Buddhism, engaged Buddhism, applying Buddhism to social situations, and to forefront, that kind of ethical commitment to social responsibility, to not letting, as a Western philosopher, modern Western philosopher said, few are guilty, all are responsible. It kind of reminds me of what Dogen was kind of getting to in that emphasis on karmic causality. So, yeah.
And Jonathan, I don't want to stop you from asking your question on poetry either, because I have a reason for that. But if you want to ask your question on poetry, please, and this will be the last one, if Dr. Heine is open.
Yes, I have, certainly.
Oh, was that me? I'm not sure I had a definite, like, pointed question there. I mean, I guess it was, do I correctly understand your interpretation of only the painting of a rice cake can satisfy hunger to mean spiritual hunger can only be sated by poetry, or that this at least is part of what motivates Dogen's poetry practice?
Yeah, well, okay, good. All right, so let me try to, sorry to interrupt, but thank you for that question. I think, let me try to take it to a little bit of a larger issue in Dogen, because, we have fascicles, Muchu Setsumu, a dream within a dream, Kuge, flowers in the sky, which usually is refers to a kind of illusion. The painting of the rice cake, which usually refers to illusion. And so, dreams, visions, paintings, that's the illusory world. And it's very easy to say, hey, those things aren't real. Like, let's come back to reality. But what Dogen consistently says, and I think this is true at any period in his life, is like what seems like it's an illusion is leading us mistake after mistake, which is a phrase that he uses several times. Mistakes, delusions lead us to realization or enlightenment. Only through working through the misleading assumptions do we come to the right mistake. It's interesting because the four Chinese characters that mean compounding mistake after mistake, and this is especially found in the fascicle called Sokushin Zebutsu, this mind is Buddha, making mistake after mistake. If you look that up in a modern Chinese dictionary, the definition is going to be the right mistake. And actually, I think that's more of a Buddhist definition in a way, we know we're as humans, we're trapped in delusions, but occasionally, eventually, hopefully frequently, we make the right mistake that gets to that point of realization. So that's what the point of rice cake is. It's one more mistake, but it's the mistake that could be the right mistake.
Nice. Thank you, Dr. Heine.
Okay, thank you.
So what we're going to do is I'm going to allow Sensei, Hojo Sensei or Shinjin Sensei, any last comments before we end and officially thank Dr. Heine for coming.
Thank you very much for such a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
And of course, thank you, Dr. Heine. Very much appreciated. I hope you can come back again. I'm sure you have a lot more to say on Dogen, and we certainly would have a lot more to ask you about it. And yes, please do. Please do.
Okay.
Yeah. And I wanted to say to Joseph, it was Jonathan? Joseph, I think. Joseph. Yeah. If you want to follow up on the Beijing Fox, contact me as you have in the past.
Thank you.
We can go over that koan.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and I enjoyed all the comments, and look forward to other opportunities. So thank you.
Yep. And Dr. Heine, one other question: if folks would like to support your work or support you, is there? Can you send me that information? I would post that if you feel so led to do that. Again, we have speakers that come here, give them their time, give them their energy, and give them their knowledge, and we want to offer people the opportunity to support their works if they would like to do so.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
All right. Again, Sangha, thank you so much. Again, thanks so much to Dr. Heine for coming and speaking with us about Dogen. And as always, we appreciate everybody's opportunity for showing up for practice. That's the most important thing. But we also know that in order for us to continue to provide these opportunities, we ask that you can, if you're grateful for those who are already contributors, but if you have not, we ask that you continue to do that so we can support our teacher, our practice space and our online practice opportunities. We do have, I'm glad Dr. Heine kind of helped me kick this off. Next Sunday is our annual community poetry share, where we are participating in either sharing original works or sharing works that inspire you in your practice. So please do join us for that next week. And as always, we have morning and evening practice opportunities available for you to support your practice as part of practicing with this community. And as always, thank you so much for your presence in your practice. And if someone will ring the bell for us, and we'll do our closing Dharma verses.
These are numberless, I vow to freedom. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to freedom. Delusions inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to freedom. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it.
Again, everyone, thank you for your presence in your practice. Have a safe week, and we'll have this recording online and available. Again, Dr. Heine, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. And we continue wishing you much success and support on your journey and teachings. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to see you. Bye-bye.